Carlos Rodon just added one of the nastiest sinkers I've seen in baseball, and it might unlock a new version of the left-hander in 2025. A one-seam fastball, as it's dubbed, is a variation of the sinking fastball that relies more on seam orientation than spin-based movement to generate vertical drop. There is a lot going on with this fun sinker. But before we talk about this nasty weapon, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to check out Fireside Yankees and not miss out on a single video we post this season. You're not going to want to miss what we're cooking up this year, so make sure to press that notification bell and join the Fireside family. Without further ado, let's talk about this nasty sinker. Carlos Rodon is a pitcher who has always been able to throw his four-seamer effectively because he has an over-the-top delivery and a high release point. It's important to understand how release points, release heights, and arm angles play a role in what makes a pitch predictable or unpredictable. And four-seamers from a high release point and a high arm angle are relatively easy to read. The reason for that is that batters have usually seen pitchers with high release heights and high arm angles throw good four-seamers with good vertical ride. Everything is relative to release height and arm angle. If a fastball has 16 inches of induced vertical break, that can be good or mediocre depending on how high you release the ball off the ground and your arm angle. Take, for example, Bryan Woo, and then compare him to someone like Luis Severino. Luis Severino may generate a little more vertical ride than Bryan Woo, but Bryan Woo's four-seam fastball is considered the better pitch because it's released from a much lower release height, and relative to that release height, he has way more vertical movement. That makes that pitch an outlier one, and at the top of the zone, hitters have a really tough time making contact and generating damage contact against that pitch, whereas Luis Severino's four-seam fastball generates more middle-of-the-pack results. It's why Severino doesn't rely on his four-seamer as much as he did when he was younger, and it's why Bryan Woo really relies on his four-seamer. This same effect can be seen with Carlos Rodon's four-seam fastball. He releases it from a really high release point with a really high arm angle, and that means that it's a predictable pitch from that arm slot. You expect pitchers with higher release points to throw fastballs that have good vertical movement, as these kinds of pitchers tend to be able to spin the ball really efficiently, getting that nice, clean vertical movement that you want from a four-seamer. Carlos Rodon has had that work against him in recent years, though. His four-seam whiff rate has tanked, batters have performed better against the pitch, and it is a pitch that hitters hope to see in order to get a home run or do damage on contact against because they know it's a pitch they can handle. It is a pitch they've seen before, it is a pitch that they commonly see in this league, and it has made people question whether that riding fastball is as desirable as it was maybe 3 to 4 years ago. Batters swing with an upwards bat path. Batters, for a lack of better terms, swing up, but pitchers deliver the ball from a higher surface, meaning that they deliver the ball down. Balls are going to descend as they approach the plate. Swings are going to ascend as they make contact or attempt to make contact with the baseball. Riding fastballs drop less, and that lack of drop typically results in pop-ups and swings and misses. But from higher release points, it doesn't have that same deceptive nature. So, pitchers have tried to expand their arsenals and do things that work against their release points or arm angles. They're trying to throw pitches that hitters don't typically see from these release points. Being unique and being different is seen as a good thing for pitching. And if you're too normal and you're too close to the pack, then you become too predictable. This is where Carlos Rodon's sinker comes into effect. This sinker generates a lot of vertical drop, which is something that's hard to do from his arm slot. In fact, if you look at pitchers who averaged 4 inches or less of induced vertical break on their sinker, none of them had a release height at or above 6 feet, and none of them had an arm angle of Carlos Rodon's to go with that high release height. So Carlos Rodon is an outlier throwing a sinker that averages less than 4 inches of induced vertical break, but is still released from a high arm slot and with a high arm angle. Again, everything is relative to release height and arm angle. And in Carlos Rodon's case, his sinker is very, very unique. It is an outlier pitch. And so while it doesn't have a lot of lateral movement, in fact, it has way less lateral movement than the average sinker, it averages over 4.5 more inches of vertical drop in terms of induced vertical break than the average sinker released from his release height with his velocity. I also think it's important to note that this sinker is going to play well against lefties and righties because of that sharp vertical drop. Righties don't really know what to do with the pitch because they don't see this pitch often, and lefties are going to be forced to hit the ball straight to the ground as they have little to no chance of getting underneath it. This reminds me of a sinker that was thrown by a former Yankee who pitched out of the bullpen with Zach Britton. His sinker is one of the best sinkers we've seen from the left-handed side in the StatCast era, and it shares a striking similarity to Carlos Rodon's sinker. Like Carlos Rodon, Zach Britton released from a higher release height with a pretty high arm angle, and yet he was still able to generate more vertical drop than the average sinker. That gave his sinker an extremely sharp vertical approach angle, and hitters had an impossible time getting underneath this pitch. He had extremely high ground ball rates, historically low launch angles against, and he was able to throw his sinker between 80 to 90% of the time and be an extremely effective pitcher. When you compare Zach Britton's 2020 sinker to Carlos Rodon's sinker from his opening day start, you see two pitches that share so many similarities in terms of what makes them unique. It is not having a lot of horizontal movement. It's not having quote-unquote overpowering velocity. It's having a ton of vertical drop while also releasing the ball from a really high angle. If you're a hitter at the plate and you're seeing a pitch being released nearly 6.5 feet off the ground and you're trying to hit it, it's going to result in not a lot of contact in the air, especially when that sinker is generating as much vertical drop as their sinkers are. And in Rodon's case, this sinker isn't relying on movement from spin, but rather movement from seam orientation in the same way that Zach Britton did. This is where the term one-seam sinker comes into effect. A one-seam sinker is a pitch that utilizes seam effects with that one seam and seam orientation to disrupt the air and create ripples that affect the movement of a pitch. Four-seam fastballs, as we mentioned, are easier to throw for guys with high release points because they're able to get a ton of movement from their spin, and that keeps that ball up in the zone. But for these kinds of sinkers, spin doesn't play as much of a role in generating that kind of movement as much as the seam orientation and seam shifted wake does. Seam shifted wake is just the fancy way of describing the process of, again, having a pitch ripple through the air due to its seam orientation and the grip of the ball. Those minor details and just shifting the grip of a pitch can have such dramatic effects on its movement, and the Yankees have been able to take that and run with it with multiple pitchers in their organization, helping them throw better sinkers, better sweepers, and better pitches as a whole. In fact, when you look at the spin axis of Carlos Rodon's four-seamer and the spin axis of Carlos Rodon's sinker, they're very, very similar. But the difference comes in how their observed movement is. While Carlos Rodon's four-seam fastball basically matches the observed spin axis in terms of movement, Carlos Rodon's sinker has a different movement profile than what you would expect from a pitch on that spin axis. His fastball and sinker have the same spin axis, but there is between 13 to 15 inches of vertical separation off of these pitches. He's getting as much drop in his sinker as he's getting on his changeup while throwing the pitch on the same axis as his four-seamer. That is insane, and that's just how much of an effect seam orientation can have on pitch movement. So when you start talking about building up a repertoire and building an arsenal, Carlos Rodon's repertoire is so different than the repertoire we've seen in previous seasons. The left-hander has added a changeup last year. He started mixing in his curveball a little more last year and dialing back the four-seam usage as a result of realizing that hitters can hit that pitch, and hitters are going to keep hitting that pitch if he keeps throwing it at the rate he does. It doesn't mean he should stay away from his four-seam fastball. That pitch is an important weapon to establish a top of the zone, something he has nothing else in his repertoire to do, but it is not a pitch he can use 50 to 60% of the time to get a bunch of swings and misses throughout the course of a season. Carlos Rodon has expanded his repertoire to now have a changeup, curveball, and a sinker to go with his slider and four-seam fastball, and hitters now have to take a variety of pitch movement profiles and arm angles into effect whenever they're at the plate. They can't sit four-seam or slider. They've got to account for a curveball you can flip in there for called strikes. They've got to account for a changeup that you can use to get swings and misses out of zone. And they've got to account for a brand new sinker that's different from sinkers they see from other left-handed pitchers. All in all, it results in a pitcher who has really, really good stuff and a deep repertoire to boot. We're seeing the death of the two-pitch starter and the revitalization of expanded arsenals and pitchers throwing the kitchen sink, even if they have high velo or good spin. Before, it was just throw a four-seamer and throw a slider because those two pitches grade out well, and the rest of your arsenal doesn't, so avoid those pitches. To, hey, your four-seamer and slider grade out well, but let's mix in an average sinker. Let's mix in that average changeup because it plays really well with your 2+ pitches. In the case of Carlos Rodon, we aren't talking about average pitches. His changeup is one of the best in terms of stuff plus. His sinker would likely get a 55 to 65 grade if he was a prospect, and his curveball is a pretty solid pitch as well. His four-seamer and slider have always been really good pitches, so it leads me to sit here and wonder if Carlos Rodon has a 5-pitch mix with 5 average to above average pitches, because if so, he will project very well for the 2025 season. He also had his highest ground ball rate in this start he's had at any point with the New York Yankees at 61.5%. He hasn't had a ground ball rate that high in a start since 2019. So this is a different pitcher from the Carlos Rodon we've seen in recent years, one who is far more mature and far smarter about how he approaches hitters than before. I look at that third inning when he allows a solo home run and then immediately allows a 103 mile per hour single on back-to-back pitches, both of them being four-seam fastballs. Before, we would see Carlos Rodon go out there and just try to overpower hitters with the fastball and try and sneak sliders in the dirt before eventually having to give in and throw a fastball that they can handle, resulting in a home run and a blow-up inning. But instead, this time, he was able to mix up his repertoire, throwing just 8 fastballs the rest of the way after throwing a heavy dosage of fastballs in the first 2 innings. His four-seamer took a backseat because it wasn't performing well. He didn't get a single swing and miss on that pitch, but he kept it in his back pocket to change eye levels and set up the rest of his repertoire. Of those 8 remaining four-seamers he threw after the home run and single, none of them were in the strike zone, but each and every one of them were vital to setting up a swing and miss later in the count. Throwing fastballs up and then throwing sliders down is a tried and true method of getting swings and misses. The same works for changeups, and honestly, the same works for stealing strikes with the curveball. And with that sinker added in this ripple and added to this mix, he's got something else to give hitters a lot of problems. I'm not sitting here and saying that Carlos Rodon's sinker is going to maintain the shape we saw yesterday, or that Carlos Rodon's sinker is going to be the best sinker in baseball, but I do think it's a pitch capable of being an above average pitch at the major league level and being used about 10 to 15 to maybe even 20% of the time, depending on the matchup. He's going to have more to throw, and that's a good thing. He has a four-seamer, he has a slider, he has a changeup, he has a curveball, and he has a sinker that he trusts to throw in any situation, and that cutter is a pitch that he might flash a little more as the season goes on. We saw this phenomenon kind of take place with Garrett Cole, as in 2022 he had his highest ERA since his Pittsburgh days, and then he showed up in 2023 with a brand new cutter, mixing in more sliders, mixing in more curveballs, and relying less on that four-seam fastball that got him killed. In 2025, we were going to see him implement some more changeups. Unfortunately, the UCL reconstruction surgery put that on pause. But if you look across the league, you'll see more two-pitch pitchers adding to their repertoire. Spencer Strider was fastball slider. Now he throws a curveball and sinker as well. Nestor Cortez was fastball cutter. Now he has a sweeper and a changeup to go with that repertoire. Guys are expanding their arsenal, they're doing more, they're making an active attempt to change their looks, and Carlos Rodon is just another guy on a long list of pitchers trying to innovate and take their game to the next level. It takes a mature and humble pitcher to realize that what got you paid $162 million doesn't work in this league anymore. And right now, we're seeing the reinvention and maybe the resurgence of a left-hander who was paid all that money to be an ace. And when he took the ball on opening day, he certainly looked like one. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about this one-seam sinker. Does it fascinate you? Do you find this pitch an interesting pitch? And do you like this kind of content? We're going to do more pitching breakdowns and talk more about the Yankees staff as the season goes on. But again, if you enjoyed today's video, it would mean the world to me if you press that like button, subscribe, and left a comment just letting us know what you guys think. You guys can also check us out on our various social media platforms like Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook. Links will all be in the description. EmpireSportsMedia.com has you covered for all of your favorite New York sports teams. And of course, we'll see you guys in the next one. Have a great rest of your day, and peace out.